Good morning, all. Welcome to the Quincy Institute webinar on the current crisis involving Gaza and the U.S. role in this crisis and the Biden administration's approach to it. We'll also be looking ahead to see how this crisis is likely to play out and how not just the U.S., but other regional states might play a role in resolving, if not the underlying issues, then some of the immediate challenges that will follow the conflict. We have three stellar guests. Aaron David Miller is at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Dennis Ross is a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I introduced those two fellows together because they both have abundant experience in government and played crucial roles, really vital roles, in the golden age of the Israel-Arab conflict and peace process. So they've got, they're the voice of experience here. They've also both written important books, reference books on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, we also have Emma Ashford for, I want to say for balance, but I mean disciplinary balance, which is to say that, she's not a practitioner, but she's a brilliant thinker about international relations and strategic thinking, how one thinks strategically and how one assesses interests and options. It will be a relief to all of us to hear from someone who's not necessarily a regional expert, although her recent book is on petrostates, and I think she's going to be great. So that's where we are now. I should add too that Emma has just written a foreign policy article that's quite intriguing on assessing the administration's Middle East policy, asking whether it has failed. So we'll be eager to hear some of her thinking on that score. I'm going to skip an introduction in terms of my own remarks. I really want to hear from the panelists, and we only have an hour. So I'm going to go first to Dennis. And Dennis, I'd like to ask you to do a couple of things in a few minutes, given the time constraints here. The one is to walk us through some of the findings, the key findings of a document that you have co-authored under the auspices of the Washington Institute on what follows this conflict. What are the policy options? What are the directions that the key states can take in ensuring that this does not happen again? So we really want to hear about that, and also your overall assessment, I think, of the Biden administration's approach to the crisis from its inception. Over to you. Are you muted, Dennis?
You would think after doing a zillion Zooms that I would start being actually unmuted. But look, Steve, I think the essence of what we were trying to do was to say there's going to be a day after. And the time to begin to think about the day after isn't on the day after. You have to begin to think in advance. It's pretty clear we know how the Israelis are defining their objective in general terms. In essence, it is a sense that they can no longer live in a situation where Hamas is able to threaten them again. There was a paradigm on the Israeli side, which was from 2009, really from most of the time that Prime Minister Netanyahu was prime minister, which was, okay, we know what Hamas is, we know what their ideology is. The truth is, it is more acceptable to live in a circumstance where every couple of years we have a conflict with Hamas, but the cost of managing that conflict is less than going back into Gaza. We got out of Gaza and we don't want to go back in. That was basically the paradigm until October 6th. October 7th changed everything, shattered that. So the attitude of the Israelis, and this, by the way, is left to right, those who have been among the forefront in even being prepared to deal directly with Hamas, which was always more of a fringe element in Israel, they take the same attitude. So there's a consensus on that. And I think there even is a kind of emerging consensus that what Israel needs to do is to destroy the Hamas military infrastructure, decimate the leadership, prevent it from being able to preserve its kind of control that way, and then get out. But you can't, even if you accept that that's what the objective is and that's what they're going to try to do, you still have to strategy for what happens when they get out, because you leave a vacuum, and the worst forces will end up filling it. So what we had in mind was, okay, what is this day out? How do we ensure that there is an interim administration with under an international umbrella, with Palestinian technocrats who can manage the day-to-day, so create a civil administration that way. There needs to be security for the civil administration and security for those who would then be managing the reconstruction, and the task there will be immense. That security needs to come from from different Arab states, meaning Morocco, Egypt, Bahrain, and the UAE, not as military forces, but as police forces. Military forces implies an occupation. So the idea was Palestinians under an international umbrella, and it could come from the UN. You wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that talked about the UN, as difficult as it might be, because you don't know whether Russia and China might veto a Security Council resolution, but you outlined there are different models for different kinds of international umbrellas. We had in mind the UN, we had in mind could be an Arab League, could be some coalition of the willing that does this, could even be what President Macron has suggested, that you take the anti-ISIS coalition, which has a built-in division of labor, and use that to deal with Hamas, and use that to deal with the day after scenario. Have the Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and Qatar help to finance and provide the bulk of finance, at least initially, of reconstruction. We didn't put this in here, but I look at Canada and others who have some international experience on the ground, including in this area, have them come in as managing the oversight and monitoring of the materials coming into Gaza to ensure they are used for their intended purpose. And that was basically the thrust of what we were writing. In terms of how the Biden administration has handled this, in general, I would say they've handled it pretty well, because they've focused on the need for reassurance. Israel faced an utter shock, the darkest day in its history. Something occurred that was unimaginable. By comparison to the surprise on October 6, 1973, this was dramatically worse, because here is within Israel proper, Israel is being, you had an onslaught that Israel had never experienced before in any war, certainly not since the 1948 war. So the shock was powerful. They needed to have this kind of support from the Biden administration. There needed to be a framing of this issue, because what we saw was absolute evil. When you begin to recount, and Hamas was obvious, we have these videos of what Hamas intended to show, what was done was unspeakable. There wasn't a shred of humanity in what one saw. And so you needed framing the way the president did. I think the focus very much on trying to deter an expansion of the war has been important. Whether that has contributed to what we're seeing in the north, or whether it's just Iran really isn't interested in losing Hamas, losing Hezbollah as its most important proxy. We can discuss still, I put it about 25% the prospect of escalation in the north. I can explain why. But I think that the administration has generally handled this well. They're obviously now trying, having created the kind of credibility that Biden did with the Israeli public, it puts him in a position where he can ask the Israelis to do things or not do things. I don't think in the end it will determine whether Israel goes in on the ground. How Israel goes in on the ground may not be quite the way people have predicted, but they will still do it at some point to be able to achieve the objective I outlined earlier. and yet it has to be done in a way that tries to minimize the civilian casualties, which is difficult in an environment where Hamas continues to try to preserve their population as human shields. They hold not just the hostages they grab, they hold the whole population hostage as well. So you have to find ways to minimize that. I think that also contributes to the need for Israel, not just the Rafah crossing, but Israel needs to open some crossings like at Kerem Shalom. And when Israel is asking, now you have 850,000 Palestinians who moved to the south, even if Hamas has tried to block them, and UNRWA is setting up like 10 cities down there, Israel needs to facilitate humanitarian assistance to those. This was kind of in toto what we had in mind, and what I think the Biden administration is actually trying to do. They're trying to strike what is a balance and based on support for Israel in circumstances that are obviously incredibly difficult.
Let me ask you two quick follow-ups, very quick. The one is, have you all given thought to what replaces the interim technocratic Palestinian administration of Gaza? And second, with respect just to the interim administration, are you aware through your connections whether governments are actually thinking in these terms now, or is this thinking really in the domain of think tanks at this point and not in government councils?
Yeah. To answer the first question, I think the PA does need to come in at a certain point, but you have to have a transitional period for two reasons. One, they're not going to come in on the back of Israeli tanks. And two, they're way too weak themselves. I would like to see not just a reconstruction package for Gaza, but a package from Arab states also to the Palestinians. My impression from conversations I'm already having is that there is a much greater openness now to doing both, but also conditioning what they do for the PA on reform and transparency. You'll recall back in 2007 when the Bush administration basically went to Abu Mazen and said, we and the donors are not going to provide assistance unless you empower Salam Fayyad to carry out reforms and clean up the place. I'm hearing from a variety of different Arab circles right now, and openness to that, which I haven't heard of, frankly, in years. Mm-hmm. And I think that has to be part of this. And I do think it's not just limited to think tanks, although I think governments at this point are still not quite there yet. They sort of understand it as a concept, but they're not really getting into the level of details even that you and I are discussing right now. I do think that there is I think this is a responsibility of the administration. Nobody else can organize this. Nobody else can mobilize what would be this kind of a international response, however it's defined under whatever umbrella, unless the U.S. does it. Others obviously will need to be a part of it, and they'll also be more likely to respond if they see the U.S. actively doing it. This is not something the Israelis can do for a whole variety of reasons. First, they can't shape it in any case. But also they're focused on one thing. We need to be very heavily focused on this, and I see that as our main responsibility.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Aaron, a couple of questions for you, if you would. Not that you have to confine yourself to answering these particular questions, but I'm interested, first of all, in what your take is on the situation in Israel. In other words, we've heard from Dennis what Israeli war aims are. What are Israelis likely to support or acquiesce in terms of actual ceasefire arrangements and the kind of post-conflict structure that Dennis has laid out? And the other thing I wanted to ask with respect to Biden's, policy, I guess, his approach to the crisis, is this: the polling suggests that Americans, poll respondents, are lukewarm at best towards Biden's handling of the crisis. And there's a surprising trend in the public opinion that seems to favor the Palestinian side, if I can put it that way, the Palestinian side over the Israeli side in this, which suggests that there's a view that the Biden administration has leaned too far in that direction. So I wanted to get your sense, not just of Israeli politics on this, but also the U.S. Domestic politics on the issue.
Yeah, first of all, let me say it's really great to be here, Steve, with you, Dennis, and Emma. Three really smart humans. Makes me smile to be a part of this. Let me just make a comment on Biden. It's easy to criticize from the outside. I'm constantly in checking my own tendencies to do that. When you're inside, obviously, there are any number of constraints. Just in framing, you asked a question that about whether or not the American public is sensing that the administration was too closely identified with Israel and in Israel's corner. I mean, I think there's a certain inevitability of this identification, which frankly was reflected in the first 10 months of how the Biden administration dealt with the most extreme right-wing fundamentalist government in the history of the state of Israel. I think Biden's approach clearly was framed in the speech of October 10th, one of the most emotional and powerful he's ever given, was obviously framed by the butchery and savagery of what occurred on October 7th. That had to be combined with the president's preternatural predisposition to support Israel. The presidential model here is not Barack Obama, it's Bill Clinton. For both men, even though they're of a different generation, the emotional and political support for Israel is literally impressed on their emotional and political DNA. And then you have domestic politics. The Republican Party has set itself up as the Israel right or wrong party. So for these three reasons, I think the initial response was inevitable. I think what you've seen evolving over time in the last 2 weeks is more nuance in that essential frame, nuance driven by the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, nuance driven by the issue of hostages. What priorities do they occupy in Israeli military and political objectives, and the growing conviction on the part of the administration, I think by week 2, that Israel had the capacity to try to destroy Hamas's military capability, but they were not thinking seriously, A, about the costs, B, about how they were going about doing it, and C, about what the day after would look like. Whether it's unusual or not to then send a 3-star specializing in counterinsurgency and what the Americans did in Mosul or not, it's actually quite intriguing to me for such an independent-minded Israeli military establishment to accept and perhaps even to benefit from that. I won't call it intrusion, but it is, I find it actually quite remarkable. I think we're 3 weeks, will be 3 weeks on Friday, 3 weeks on Friday, which is actually quite extraordinary, the beginning of the 3rd week. And we're still in early days. I give the Biden administration grade, frankly. If you look at the 4 main components of the crisis, right? Humanitarian assistance, what to do about hostages, deterrence with respect to escalation, and the basic organizing principle of the Biden administration's approach, which frankly has, and Dennis knows very well, as do I, the sort of organizing principle of the way the United States always reacts with respect to crises. The idea of hugging the Israelis, building up trust and confidence on the assumption that that trust and confidence can be deployed later when the truly hard decisions and hard conversations need to be had. Now, it's still very much an open question about whether or not that strategy, how effective that strategy is. They clearly have bought time and space for hostage negotiations, number one. They've pressed the Israelis hard on humanitarian assistance, although I have to say, not even Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, reading the best of Godin trails, could probably unwind for us exactly why humanitarian assistance is not surging through Rafah. It's obviously because of Egyptian, Israeli, and Hamas agendas and priorities, which have conspired to witness a trickle. You need 500 trucks at a minimum, even to meet Gaza needs pre-hostility, and you're not getting them. How come? I still have no answer to that question. And then, of course, the ground campaign. Is the administration effectively just trying to reshape Israeli tactics, or, I can't answer this, are they interested in a plan B, an alternative to what the Israelis initially had in mind? Just one more observation. I'm not an Israeli. I don't play one on TV. Obviously, there are those who might argue with that sort of self-description, but I think that what happened on October 7th, in my judgment, when I strip it all away, above the humanitarian, above the horrors that were inflicted on 1,400 Israelis. And in some cases, it wasn't just an intelligence failure, it was an operational catastrophe. It took anywhere from 3 to 12 hours to redeem those who survived. And my read on this is what is at stake is the very essence of a government's legitimacy, which lies in the social contract between the governed and those who govern. That contract was shattered in so many respects on October 7th. It wasn't just fear, it was fear married to helplessness. And you see that, by the way, in the suffering of hundreds of thousands of Gazans who have been displaced, whether or not you believe, as the president questioned, the Palestinian Ministry of Health controlled by Hamas. Let's assume it's not 5,000. Let's assume it's 3,500 or 4,500. It's that contract that the current government needs to somehow restore. And that means producing an effective operation that actually works, restoring Israel's image in the region and in the world, and its deterrence and its contract with its own public. So there's a lot riding on. One more observation. Dennis raised October 73. I was in Jerusalem on October 6, 1973. And I have to say, when I look at that experience as opposed to now, there was a complete blackout. There was no CNN, there was no internet, there was no social media. What you see now is the kind of transparency with respect to the horrors of the stories that were told in the wake of October 7th, and the horrors of what's happening in Gaza now are amplified with an urgency and a terrifying immediacy that just plays to the already divided debate in America on the U.S.-Israeli relationship and Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. That, I think, exacerbates the polarization. In 25 years of working in the State Department, not once did I ever experience what apparently is going on now, when the Secretary of State has to call a meeting in order literally to mediate and moderate a kind of mini Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is going on among staff. And it was true at the White House as well. Now, I know we're in the it's okay to share mode, which is a unique sort of cultural comment on current reality. But I think this debate is more polarized and more volatile than I've ever seen it. Dennis, I don't know if you agree, but I think there's something in that. I don't want to blame it on the media, but it's directly a result of what people are actually seeing and then feeling.
Okay, Aaron, I'm going to return later to your point about the social contract, because I think it's important to follow up on it if we're going to be thinking about the kind of Israel that the United States is going to be dealing with when they come out of this tunnel. And I want to turn now to Emma, but please be thinking about that question in the interim. Emma, hi. I'd be really interested in your maybe high altitude take on the U.S. approach to this crisis. You know, the 50,000-foot view, particularly regarding what U.S. interests really are in this crisis. What stake does the United States have in it? And against those considerations and others that you might bring to bear, has the Biden administration really reflected those interests in its approach to this crisis, or not? Over to you, Emma.
Well, great, thanks. And I'm really happy to be here, particularly with two fellow panelists who have such deep regional experience and knowledge over the years. So from, as you say, my marching orders, from the 50,000-foot level, I think the Biden administration has done a reasonably good job in many ways, right? They've done a pretty good job, I think, on the deterrence side. They've dialed back some of the more problematic rhetoric over about the last week. There's a very, very clear attempt on the part of the administration at the same time as they are pushing forces into the region to try and deter Iran, to try and deter a bigger escalation. There does appear to be a very real attempt to signal, we do not want this fight. We do not want a war with Iran. We are not going to let this escalate. And I think that is pretty much the best that they could have done under these circumstances. And so that has been fairly good. I am concerned, as some of my fellow panelists might have mentioned, I'm a little concerned about how much the administration has leaned in on the Israeli side, just in terms of how it plays more globally. It has not, I think, escaped notice in parts of the global south that the US is taking a very different approach to this conflict and to Palestinian casualties than it has towards, say, casualties in Ukraine. This is a comparison lots of folks have made. So that is a little problematic more broadly. I think more importantly and more practically, it impedes the ability of the US to act as a broker or a mediator. We've really ceded that role, particularly to the Qataris, but to other governments at this point. And that's one interesting contrast with the 1973 case, right, where the US did support Israel, including with weapons, quite strongly, but where Kissinger then also went out to the region, engaged in really aggressive shuttle diplomacy, sort of trying to bring the parties to some sort of ceasefire and understanding. And while we've seen Blinken engage in a lot of shuttle diplomacy, and that's great, I'm not really sure what his policy aim has been other than on humanitarian aid. So we seem to be thinking a lot smaller than we used to. And I think the irony of this in a regional context, in a global context, is that, the US has been building up these ties in recent years in the region, really leaning in on Israel and the Gulf states with the hope of trying to push China back and Chinese influence back in the region. And I think the end result of this crisis might be to delegitimize the US a little more broadly in parts of the Arab world here. The Chinese don't want to be involved in this crisis. They don't have to be involved in this crisis because they are not present in the region to the extent the US is, and they benefit from that. So let me just make, I guess, a few comments. You asked about interests and about sort of the strategic context. I think, US interests here are very similar to what they always have been in this region, right? We want to make sure that Israel can defend itself. Here we have an interest in hostages that are US citizens that are being held, and I would argue that is a significant interest for the US government. But I think the biggest US interest here is ensuring that this doesn't spiral into some sort of broader war. And I think over time, over the last 3 weeks, what we have seen is the administration kind of moving from A to B to C there, right? Very much leaning in on Israel in the early days after the horrific Hamas attack, but leaning in more now, I think, on ensuring that whatever Israel does going forward does not then spiral out of control into a two-front or even a regional war. We still have interests in energy flows. The energy dimension of this conflict is less problematic than in some previous conflicts. Again, this is not 1973. Nobody's talking about oil embargoes. But if this escalates to a regional level, those dynamics start to become present, right? One of the more obvious ways for Iran to retaliate against US and Western interests in the region is to go after shipping. This is the same as it has been for decades. This is something, again, that I think a lot of people are beginning to grasp about changing energy flows, but just because most of that energy flowing through the Gulf is going east to China and other Asian states, it's still going to impact prices if there is a war. So that's a concern for policymakers too. So I guess let me make two final points here before passing it back to you. One is, I think this conflict overall highlights a dynamic we saw with Ukraine and in the administration's policy more broadly, which is the US is trying to do a lot everywhere, all at once. Biden really tried to sort of dial down US commitments to the region while pursuing a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement that would actually tie us into those interests more deeply. That's quite similar to the way we've approached Europe, where we tried to, in the early days of the administration, park Russia, make sure it wasn't an issue so we could move towards Asia, but doubling down on NATO and US presence in Europe. And so there are similar dynamics here. And I think there's a genuine concern this conflict highlights about US overstretch and where we actually end up here. So all of that to say, I think the administration's posture and approach the last few weeks has been very understandable, but I'd raise a couple of big caveats, right? First, if the deterrent posture here is not a bluff, we might be about to fight a major war in the Middle East. And, that should concern everybody. Second caveat would be, I think the administration really needs to grapple with the extent to which US policy under Trump and under Biden contributed to the dynamics that led us here today, the sort of marginalization of the Palestinian question. And then third caveat, I will just reframe Dennis's question, right? What comes after? What comes next for US policy in the region? Not the Israel-Palestine question, not what Israel does, not what the Gulf states do. What does the US presence in the region look like going forward? I don't think they have a good answer for that yet. So thanks again for hosting this discussion. There's a lot of questions on the table.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions, and we're going to get to them in a moment. But I had one or two follow-ups for you, if you don't mind. The one is I was going to ask what you thought about the prospects for U.S. direct involvement, military involvement in a widened conflict. Okay, and we're looking at two potential scenarios which aren't mutually exclusive. The one is that in some set of circumstances, aircraft from the USS Gerald Ford will be attacking targets in Lebanon or Syria or perhaps elsewhere. I'm just asking that because people have been talking about it. I don't really know myself. And the second is how you see escalation, if at all, in the event that Iranian proxies draw American blood in Iraq or Syria.
So I think those are both excellent questions, not least because both are actually already happening in practice, right? We have already seen the USS Carney engaging with missiles that had been fired by militants in Yemen, we believe towards Israel, but shot those down over, I think it was last weekend. We have seen escalation by Iranian-aligned proxies inside Syria, inside Iraq, against US forces in those theaters. We know there haven't been any deaths, at least as far as we're aware, but I believe there's been sort of a couple of dozen minor casualty injuries at this point. So we're already seeing the start of an escalation cycle there, and that's, I think, very concerning. So the big question, and I'm not sure anyone really knows the answer to at this point, is if this does escalate, right? So you could definitely see, I think, a fairly likely scenario in which the Israelis go into Gaza and Hezbollah takes the opportunity to cause trouble up north, right? You could definitely see a scenario, I think, in that case, where the US, at the very least, is pressured to respond to attacks on US forces in that situation. I'm less concerned about a larger regional escalation that pushes all the way up to a direct war with Iran, because my sense from the signaling is that nobody right now wants that. But I think the thing that we need to be much more careful of is sort of these smaller steps up the escalation ladder, because that's how you eventually get to that broader conflict. But to answer your direct question, I am not 100% sure if the administration would be willing to engage in direct conflict in order to protect Israel. I think we might be, and I do find that a little concerning.
Okay, Emma, so my second follow-up, just briefly, is in terms of the post-conflict scenario, in the way that Dennis has talked about it, and Aaron, is there a plausible alternative in your view to essentially the U.S. taking charge of whatever process results, the formation and the implementation of whatever plan is developed by Arabs and others to manage Gaza, and once the guns have cooled?
So, I think this is one of the key problems with US policy to the region, is that we have, particularly in recent years, tried to make sure that the US is always an essential part of any sort of discussions around specific conflicts in the region, whether it's Syria, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's this, Saudi-Israeli normalization. I think you could potentially see regional states stepping up and working amongst themselves. One thing that really caught my interest was the call that happened between Saudi and Iranian leadership. That hasn't happened in quite some time. And so there is, I think, a potential here for the region to work not together, but to at least come to some sort of understanding in the absence of the US. But I don't think that is going to happen. I think the Biden administration will be pushing for a very strong US involvement in what comes next.
Yeah, I tend to agree, actually. Well, thank you for that. Let me turn to some of the questions that have been submitted by our viewers. One, which I'll paraphrase, is this: how likely is Israel to be able to carry out its war aims, actually to do what it's set out to do or intends to do vis-a-vis Hamas? And would that be more harmful to Israel than helpful? So this is a question for all three of you. Maybe let's start with Dennis, and then Aaron and Emma.
Yeah, look, I think it's a fair question. I think it's actually it's part of the discussion that the Biden administration, including the president specifically, has had with the prime minister and even with the war cabinet when he was there. What are your capabilities to achieve the objectives you're establishing for yourself? I do think the Israeli model here is not Fallujah. It's not to go door to door. It's not to disarm every single person who identifies with Hamas. It is, I think, more limited, but still more strategic in terms of its implication, meaning destroy the military infrastructure that's been built up so it's not so easy to rebuild, and in a sense, decapitate the leadership so it loses its command control. I think the intent then is actually to get out. Now, one can ask the question, how quickly can you get out under those circumstances? But I'm not sure that that's an unachievable objective. What's clear is having an outcome of this war that makes it look like Hamas won will be a disaster for the region, because it means the ideology of rejection gains an enormous boost in the region. It means the imagery that the Hamas way works gains a boost in the region. It means all those who actually have very little interest in the development or modernization of the region gain a boost, meaning the sort of the Iranian axis, what they call the axis of resistance. So that is a strategic outcome that one has to be aware of. If you basically say, if you ask the question, would Israel be better off if they didn't do this? The real question, I think, for me is how achievable is the objective they've set for themselves, which was the essence of the question, and how can you do that in the least amount of time with the least amount of casualties? That may be, a very hard balance to strike, but you're weighing, in a sense, what are excruciating kinds of options. You don't go in and Hamas is able to emerge from this with a ceasefire that looks a lot like what we saw in 2014. 52 days of conflict, and then Hamas is able to rebuild entirely and is going to do this again. And there is a kind of Iranian strategy towards Israel, which is make it unlivable and use Hamas and Hezbollah to make it unlivable. One of the things about Iran has been they're always keen. They're quite willing to fight to the last of their proxies. They're not willing to take a whole lot of casualties themselves. Now, the truth is that also helps to create a sense that they're not so keen on looking to raise the risk to themselves. So I guess my answer to this is it's a tough set of choices to make, but we have to think of both what are the costs of action and what are the costs of inaction. That's why I said there needs to be, in Israel, there needs to be much greater awareness of the humanitarian costs and how that plays internationally and how that's seen. And there needs to be more of an effort made by Israel to make sure, especially if you're moving, you keep encouraging people to move to the south, well, then you need to ensure that people are safe down there. And even that may pose risk to Israel because Hamas may try to infiltrate in there, but there has to be a balance here as well. Israel needs the time and space to do what it wants to do, but it also needs to act in a way that makes it easier to have that time and space. And at this point, I would say they need to do a more convincing job that they're trying both to avoid civilian casualties and they're doing more to ensure that real humanitarian assistance can get in there in the amount and the numbers and the quality that is needed.
Thanks, Dennis. Aaron?
Look, I'm not sure what the Israeli objective is. If the objective is to undermine Hamas's military capacity and kill its leadership, that is clearly attainable. If the objective, however, is to go beyond that, which is essentially to replace Hamas by undermining its sovereignty, its capacity to control Gaza, and its governing apparatus, that is a much harder objective. It's going to take much longer to achieve. And, Colin Powell's pottery barn rule applies, at least in the beginning. The Israeli Minister of Defense said 2 days ago, look, it's going to be a long war. It may take 1 month. It may take 2 months. It may take 3 months. Eradication of a terrorist organization is possible. Peru did it to the Shining Path in the 90s. Sri Lanka decimated Tamil Tigers. The cost of Peruvian democracy, and in the case of Sri Lanka, according to UN estimates, 40,000 people were killed. So I think that's the distinguishing factor. And based on what Dennis says, I think the Israelis really face an almost impossible situation, because preventing Hamas from declaring victory, which is essentially to survive. That is all Hamas has to do, is to survive an Israeli onslaught. And presumably wage a series of attacks against Israeli occupation forces if they are going to stay. So it's inextricably tied, it seems to me, to the day after, and what could conceivably replace Hamas in that respect. And I have grave doubts about whether or not the Palestinian Authority, which is the logical choice, weak and ineffectual as it is, can do it. Not on the back of an Israeli tank. I don't think that's the issue. It's on the back of a situation in which Hamas is destroyed, with additional thousands of Palestinian deaths and casualties.
Thank you. Emma.
Yeah, so I'm afraid I'm not sure I have a lot to add here, except I guess to draw out sort of the US policy implications here, because I think both Aaron and Dennis are sort of characterizing the problem for Israel here quite effectively, which is that there are no good options. All of the options involve some inherent risk, not going in, the humanitarian crisis, etc. And so from the US point of view, I think the real dilemma is, the Biden administration is effectively backing a partner state, an ally who is facing this sort of no-win situation. And we understand that the administration is pushing the Israeli government quite strongly to consider those questions of what comes after, which tactics are best, taking steps as extreme as sort of sending US military officers to try and talk them through some of these issues. But whatever the Israeli government ends up doing, the US government is going to be tied to that. And so I think for US policymakers, I'm not clear whether it is possible at this point to create any space there. But that, I think, is the major concern for US policymakers.
Thanks, Emma. Two follow-ups for you, and then the same for Aaron and Dennis. The US government, the Biden administration, is pretty sanguine, I think, about the risk of escalation. And I think this is what the intelligence community is imparting to policymakers, and I think policymakers are glad to hear that assessment. So, the one follow-up was, well, would you be sanguine as well? You sound somewhat relaxed about it, but I just wanted to follow up on that. And then the other follow-on, which is also for our other two panelists, is does this kill off Saudi-Israeli normalization? Put on your petrostate hat, for that one. Do you mind?
Yeah, no, this is again, good questions. So I would not call myself relaxed about escalation. I guess I would draw for you a distinction between purposeful escalation and accidental escalation. I think, the intelligence community appears to be, I think, correctly assessing that nobody here really wants a regional war, right? All the signals that we are seeing emanate from Tehran, even from Tel Aviv, as well as from US policymakers. Nobody wants this to escalate on purpose, right? Even the voices in Washington that normally call for bombing Iran, even some of them are quite muted on this. There's the question of accidental step by step escalation. And I think that's a very real concern, in large part because I think, one of the questions that's been raised by the Hamas attack on Israel is, to what extent does Iran actually have that control over its proxies? To what extent can it deter them? Can it stop them from going further than it wants? That's an open question. And so I do think there's still that escalation risk, but I'm not overly concerned that this is something that regional states want to escalate. The question of whether this kills normalization, I may defer mostly to my fellow panelists on this. My general sense is that it puts it in the icebox for some long period of time. At least from the point of view, however, of the Saudi government, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, there's a strong incentive to follow through on this once things have calmed down. The Saudis are keen to continue building on technological cooperation with the Israelis. There are trade ties there that could be expanded. Both sides would benefit from this. The question for the Saudi government has always been the question of whether you can push it through over the objections of older elites who may be more pro-Palestinian and over the objections of the street. And so it's definitely on ice, but whether it actually kills it, I think is an open question.
Thanks, Emma. Dennis?
Let me start with the second question and then go back to the first. I agree with what Emma said on the Saudis. I think, look, in the case of Saudis, there was a lot for them to gain in their mind, especially MBS, from what he was going to get from the United States. That is still a strategic interest of his, and that hasn't disappeared. Now, the question is the atmosphere going to become so royal that it becomes more difficult to do that? And I think that's a function of how long this goes on. If it goes on for a long time and the casualty levels remain high and the imagery, in fact, and on social media is terrible, it will raise the cost to doing it. So I think it's, for sure, it's not dead, but the atmosphere and the reality of this conflict and how long it goes on can affect its likelihood. On the issue of escalation, I would say it's not only that we don't want it. Think who else doesn't want it outside the region and who also has influence on Iran? China. Russia wants it to go on as long and be as terrible as possible because it makes it much harder for us to sustain, as you see with the House of Representatives, much harder for us to sustain support for Ukraine. And actually, the worse it gets is the price of oil goes up from a Russian standpoint, great. Just the opposite with the Chinese, not in their interest at all. Their economy is reeling in a lot of ways for a whole variety of structural reasons right now. They're the world's biggest importer of oil from the Middle East. This is not what they want, and they have some real influence on the Iranians. So I don't think anybody necessarily wants it, but I will pick up on what Emma said, which I agree with. I'll put it slightly differently. When you signal with the use of force, the problem with the signaling with the use of force is what Hezbollah is doing, trying to tie down the Israelis in the north, ensure a large force remains there. You can hit the wrong target. And the same for the Israelis when they retaliate. You can hit the wrong target, and you might not intend escalation, but you end up with escalation. So, as you know, contingency planning is based not necessarily on the likelihood, it's based on severity of consequence. So I think the likelihood is it doesn't, but you ask, am I relaxed? My answer would be no, I am not relaxed at all.
Aaron?
Well, if you define regional escalation, not just as a return to the summer of 2006, although this time more devastating because of the increase of Hamas's high trajectory weapons repositories in range and lethality. But if regional escalation means a direct, and let me be clear here, a direct conflict between Israel and Iran, directly with the Israelis striking Iranian territory, conventional, unconventional sites, and the Americans participating, I'm relatively relaxed about that. But the Israelis stepped into, and Hassan Nasrallah, in one of the most extraordinary missions after the summer of 2006, said if he knew what the outcome was, they never would have engaged by grabbing those two Israeli soldiers, kidnapping those two Israeli soldiers. On Israeli-Saudi normalization, in Israeli politics, you can be dead or you can be dead and buried. And I would argue that the Israeli-Saudi normalization process is just dead. I would note one fact, however. You're dealing with a 38-year-old would-be presumptive king of Saudi Arabia, who during his lifetime in ruling Saudi Arabia is going to encounter at a minimum, by my calculations, depending on whether presidents are 1 or 2 terms, 6 or 7 US presidents. 6 or 7 US presidents. Joe Biden, in that respect, in many respects, is a speed bump. And if this conflict generates tremendous complexity and endures and drags on, I suspect, given the 360-degree foreign policy that MBS is pursuing, that he'll figure out a way to delay or not deal with the question of Israeli-Saudi normalization now.
Thanks, Aaron. So we've got all of 3 minutes. I wanted to ask one more question. It just thumbs up, thumbs down, I guess. And this is, I think, more for Aaron and Dennis because of their familiarity with Israel. But anyway, I'd love to hear from all of you. Just thumbs up, thumbs down. The United States and Israel have a very important relationship. It's historically important within the context of U.S. foreign policy, but also domestic policy. We sort of understand this. We know the relationship has been strained as the government has shifted to the right over recent years. Do you all think that the government that ultimately emerges from this crisis will be more to the right or more to the center? Just a quick snap judgment. Aaron?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
You're going to see a course corrective, and the question you posed, Steve, is a critically important one. I not because I'm by nature hopeful as I get older, between judicial overhaul and this government's presiding over, probably given civilian casualties, the most catastrophic intelligence failure in the history of the state of Israel. And we haven't even seen how it's going to play out. That there will be a course corrective, and that course corrective will lead to a more center-right government with high regard for civil discourse, the norms of democratic practice, and independent judiciary, but will remain extremely withholding on the issue of what I would call a comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem.
Got it. Dennis?
I have a slightly similar but slightly different view. I think there will be a political reckoning in Israel that is inevitable. I think you will see a course correction, as Aaron said, but I also think you're going to see something that Aaron didn't say. I think you're going to see a debate, the first debate we've seen on the Palestinian issue, at least since the withdrawal from Gaza. And we haven't seen a debate within Israel. You're going to see those who say, look, this proves we can't have a Palestinian state because, look, we could take it over. And there's going to be another school that says, okay, we've taken care of Hamas. Anyone who thinks that we can freeze the Israeli-Palestinian situation exclusively on our terms and not produce a successor to Hamas, they're dreaming. That debate is coming, but it doesn't come until after you've had the political reckoning.
I tend to agree with both of you, even though your views differ slightly. I suppose I don't know. It's a manifestation of my own uncertainties more generally. Thank you all very much, Emma, Dennis, Aaron. This has been a very stimulating and I think very useful conversation. And looking forward to more down the road.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.